Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Sounds good. Okay. All right. Thank you, Amanda. And thank you to the rest of the RTI team, Dr. Kevin Strom and his team for allowing myself and Sergeant Hudson to present today. So as Amanda stated, my name is Ashley Rodriguez. I am one of the program managers here at RTI in the Center for Forensic Science Advancement and Application. I am also one of the forensic advisors on our Sexual Assault Kit Initiative Training and Technical Assistance Program. Moving forward, I will refer to that as SACI TTA just for the ease of explanation. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with SACI, we're going to talk about it just a little bit in a few minutes. But essentially, it is a national program that has been funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance since 2015. And BJA provides funding to agencies throughout the country, excuse me, who are seeking to combat sexual assaults and other violent crimes within their jurisdiction. So, as the TTA provider here at RTI, our primary role is to be able to support those grantees, helping them identify challenges and overcome the obstacles that they may be facing with these types of investigations. And as a forensic advisor, I spend the majority of my time helping those agencies who are seeking to apply advanced forensic methodologies to their cases. And you can imagine that right now I spend the bulk of my time working with agencies on forensic genetic genealogy, since that is the hot topic. And you may be wondering, how I got to this point or what my involvement with genealogy has been thus far. I am not law enforcement. I did not come from a lab. I am not a genealogist. So my background is that prior to coming to RTI, I spent about 13 years working at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the Forensic Services Unit. And while I was there, I managed a caseload of approximately 400 unidentified deceased child cases. And I worked with law enforcement and medical examiners throughout the country to try to come up with investigative and forensic strategies to give these children their names back. After the arrest of the Golden State Killer in 2018, we had agencies from everywhere reaching out to us about those cases, wanting to know if we could apply genealogy to those investigations in an attempt to identify these children. And for myself and my team at NCMEC, it was pretty much a crash course in late 2018, early 2019, where we were kind of thrown into it and we needed to learn as much as we could about genealogy. So we worked with the genealogists, we worked with the labs, and I have kind of been in this space of supporting law enforcement and other criminal justice practitioners ever since then, and trying to help them come up with the most effective and appropriate ways to apply genealogy to cold case investigations. So that is why I am here speaking on genealogy. And then later on in the presentation, I will be turning it over to Sergeant Hudson, who will be talking about the work that they are doing in Fayetteville, not only as a SACI grantee, but as a SACI grantee who is using those funds to apply genealogy to some of their cold case crimes. Before we get into the presentation too far, I do have a couple disclaimers. This first disclaimer, just please keep in mind that the points of view and opinions expressed throughout this presentation are of the presenters, and they do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. This second disclaimer is our disclaimer just talking about the presumption of innocence. You will hear potentially about a couple cases towards the end of the session. And just keep in mind that the decision to present this information lies solely on Fayetteville Police Department. And for the cases that are not fully adjudicated, the defendants and or suspects that are referenced herein are presumed innocent until or unless proven guilty. All right, our objectives. I talked about this just a little bit, but we're going to start out with a relatively brief overview of the SACI program. We're going to talk about how the funding can be used to support not only sexual assaults, but how the program has grown, and that now the funding can actually be used to support all types of violent cold case crimes. And for those of you who are not familiar with SACI, or maybe for even those of you who are, I don't know if everyone realizes that SACI was the first federal program that supported the use of federal funds for the application of genealogy to criminal investigations. So there is kind of the tie between why we're talking about SACI, and then we'll be jumping into forensic genetic genealogy. But the SACI program does support a lot of genealogy work. And as you'll hear from Fayetteville, it's proving to be it's something that a lot of our SACI sites are focused on right now and applying it not only to sexual assaults, but other types of violent crime. And it's making an impact when we talk about the idea of apprehending or identifying serial offenders. So once we talk through SACI just a little bit, we are going to switch to the bulk of today's presentation, which will be on forensic genetic genealogy. I'll be providing an overview of exactly what genealogy is, how it can be applied to cases, how it works. And then, as I mentioned, we will close out the session with Sergeant Hudson talking about the work that is being done in Fayetteville. All right, so the National Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. All right, so what is SACI? As I mentioned, SACI is a national program that has been funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance since 2015. The program started after realizing that as a country, we had a big problem with a growing number of sexual assault kits sitting in law enforcement custody, never being submitted to a lab for processing. The program was designed to support sexual assault response reform, to reduce violent crime, and to improve overall public safety. One of the goals of SACI is to help jurisdictions create a coordinated community response to cold case sexual assault and violent crime, and to help ensure a just resolution whenever possible through a victim-centered approach. SACI aims to help or to support these jurisdictions with the investigation and prosecution of these types of crimes, and to also help them build jurisdictional capacity to make sure that the conditions that were present that led to the high numbers of unsubmitted kits and other cold case evidence, just to make sure that those conditions never happen again. When we look at the national impact of the SACI program, as of this year, we have 90 SACI sites throughout the country, and 31 of those sites are considered statewide sites, which means that technically any jurisdiction within that state would have access to SACI funding and SACI resources. And by looking at the map, you can see that our sites are spread out, again, all across the country. We actually have sites in 43 different states and the District of Columbia. So our goal over the next couple of years is to try to get representation in all of the states. We're very close at this point. And when we talk about the amount of money invested, BJA has been able to invest more than $375 million in this program since 2015, with the bulk of that obviously going to the agencies to be able to support their testing and investigation of these crimes. A few stats that I want to bring your attention to. So since 2015, SACI has been able to identify the SACI sites have been able to identify and inventory more than 200,000 unsubmitted sexual assault kits. Close to 99,000 of these kits have already been sent off for testing, resulting in over 38,000 DNA profiles being uploaded into CODIS, and more than 18,000 hits have been received. I draw your attention back to that very first number. Just think about it. If it's 209,483 people is what this number represents. So victims and survivors that are living within your communities and who want answers, I think that number alone really shows the impact that this program has had over the past several years. A couple other numbers just to draw your attention to. Those two numbers in the center and the bottom line in the center, they obviously look a little low, right, compared to all the other stats that we have. The cases charged and convictions, there's no surprise that COVID certainly played a role with our SACI sites. Our SACI sites were delayed in moving these cases forward with trial. Even still, post-COVID, we are seeing a 3 to 5 year delay kind of across all of our sites, but we do hope that those numbers will increase. The other caveat here with these numbers is that the prosecution is not the end goal for SACI. Anyone who has worked in cold case investigations, you know that it's not uncommon to identify offenders through cold case investigation and that suspect is deceased, or potentially is incarcerated, serving a life sentence for something else. So prosecution is not the end game for SACI necessarily. SACI strives for case resolution, whatever that may be. And the last couple of numbers that we will talk about leading into our discussion on genealogy. Of those more than 18,000 CODIS hits, I don't think that we would be surprised to find that close to 3,000 of them are to serial sex offenders. I don't think that that would surprise anyone in the room. But what the number that is more surprising, I guess, depending on how you look at it, is that close to 10,000 of these hits have been to serial violent offenders. And these are individuals that don't necessarily have any criminal history of a sexually motivated crime. So these are offenders who are committing homicides and other types of violent crimes. And it's this number and other findings from across our SACI investigators that has really driven the growth of the program and has influenced how SACI has expanded just within the past couple of years. And we will talk about that in just a second. SACI is divided into 6 different purpose areas at this point. When it started, it was just one. And as I continue to state, the program has grown and we are now at 6 different purpose areas, all with kind of a unique focus. And some of these purpose areas, as you will see, genealogy plays a huge role in what the investigators are doing with their funding. So I'm going to go through these relatively quickly just to show you kind of what our SACI sites are doing, how they're able to use their funds, and where genealogy is really coming into play to try to help our sites identify some of these serial offenders. Purpose Area 1, this comprehensive approach to sexual assault kits. If you hear SACI or the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, this is what you are probably thinking of. It's the traditional SACI. It's funding that is being used to test a backlog of unsubmitted kits. So this was the initial approach to the SACI program, and this supports the funding can be used to support the identification, inventory, and testing of these kits. Purpose Area 2, SACI for small agencies, is very similar to Purpose Area 1. It's just aimed towards those small rural and tribal agencies, recognizing that these agencies likely don't need the extensive funding that some of the other larger agencies would need to address their backlogs. Purpose Area 3, LawFLEO DNA. I'm not going to go into this a whole lot because I know right after my presentation, my colleague Lindsay Wade is going to give you an entire presentation on LawFLEO DNA and some of the loopholes that have been identified. But just for your awareness, SACI does provide funding for agencies who have already demonstrated that they have addressed their kits as far as the testing goes, and that they are making progress towards the investigation and prosecution of those cases. This is another purpose area that they can come in for that allows them to address the identification, the collection, and the testing of those LawFLEO DNA samples that were, for whatever reason, they were never collected or submitted to a laboratory. All right, Purpose Area 4, this is when we start getting into the discussion on genealogy. Purpose Area 4 is almost a next step or a next phase of SACI. So Purpose Area 1, agencies are coming in, they're getting their kits tested, they're getting everything uploaded into CODIS, and they start getting hits. So how are they able to support, investigating all of those hits and moving forward with prosecution? And this is where Purpose Area 4 comes in. This provides funding to support all those investigative and prosecutorial activities associated with these cases. And there, I threw up some of the bullets for different ways that the funding has been used. Establishing cold case units, being able to enter all cases into VICAP, travel costs associated with different types of interviews. But this is where we are really seeing a lot of agencies start to become interested in forensic genetic genealogy. So the funding is used to support the follow-up from the CODIS hits, but what happens if there is no CODIS hit? And this funding is able to help those investigators start thinking about, next steps for those cases when we're not getting a hit. And for most of them at this point, they are exploring the option of FGG. I threw up some of these stats from the SACI program. These are recent as of earlier this year. But as of right now, the number of samples that we have submitted as a program for genealogy is at 336. That has resulted in 192 profiles. And then, as you can see, we have been moving forward with 71 prosecutions, and 116 cases have been closed by exceptional means. So, in looking at the number of prosecutions and the number of cases that are closed compared to the number of cases that have been submitted, if my math is correct, I think we are just about at a 56% success rate, which that in itself is fantastic. But I will say that that number is really expected to go up and to increase because of the cases that have not yet been resolved. They're all at different phases of the genealogy process. So some of them are still in the testing phase, some of them are in the tree building phase. So that number and that percentage will certainly go up. It's just a matter of time until those cases can work themselves through. All right, purpose area 5, very quickly. This was a new purpose area that was implemented relatively recently within the past 2 or 3 years. One of the things that's pretty unique, I think, about Saki is that the grantees don't want to leave the program. So we have a lot of sites that have been with us since 2015. And this purpose area was designed with those sites in mind. It's those sites who have addressed their kits, they've addressed their backlogs, they're making progress with investigations and prosecutions, and they really are ready to graduate from the SACI program. So this purpose area allows funding to allow them time and the resources to be able to implement those sustainable changes in in their policies and procedures to ensure that they are ready to take the next step and maintain what they have been doing just without that extra SACI funding. All right. And lastly, purpose area 6, the National Cold Case Initiative. This purpose area was added just this past year. Um, as we talked about earlier with the stats, a lot of our CODIS hits we are seeing they are to serial offenders with other violent cold case crimes. When we dive into that a little bit deeper, what we are seeing across our SACI sites is that investigators are finding that approximately 65% of the offenders that have been linked to their sexual assault kits have prior convictions for non-sexual violent offenses. And more than 78% of the DNA CODIS hits to serial offenders are, in fact, attributed to violent serial offenders as opposed to serial sex offenders. So because of that, because of what we have learned, SACI has expanded into this Purpose Area 6, the National Cold Case Initiative, which allows funding to support all types of violent crime. So this Purpose Area 6, the cases that can be supported under here do not have a sexual component. They cannot be sexually motivated. But this purpose area, the funding can be used in a similar manner to what we talked about with Purpose Area 4. So it supports the investigation and the prosecution of these cases. And so again, here we are already seeing, even just within the first year, almost all of the SACI grantees who have this award are pursuing genealogy for their cases, cases that have been uploaded into CODIS, with no hits. And now this is providing them with an opportunity to try to advance those cases with the application of genealogy. All right. So that was a very relatively quick overview of SACI. But I wanted to make sure that everyone at least understood, what the program was about, why I am here, why Sergeant Hudson is here. And now we will go ahead and jump into an overview of genealogy. But before I do, just by a show of hands, who has worked a case or been involved with a case that has gone through the genealogy process so far? A couple? Okay. All right. So hopefully this will be a good overview. And for those of you who have gone through genealogy, I hope it's not incredibly boring, but we'll jump right in. So what is forensic genetic genealogy? So the dictionary defines genealogy as the study of family ancestral lines. So in practice, genealogists are using oral histories, historical records, genetic data, and other relevant resources to be able to trace their heritage and to trace their family lineage. Forensic genetic genealogy is defined as law enforcement's use of DNA analysis combined with traditional genealogy research to generate investigative leads for unsolved violent crimes. So in other words, we're using the same traditional genealogy techniques and methods. We're combining that with forensic DNA, And we're using that to generate leads for law enforcement that will hopefully help them identify unknown suspects and unknown victims. This document, the interim policy on forensic genetic genealogy, I recognize the name is a lot longer, but it's a lot easier just to state the interim policy on FGG, was issued by the Department of Justice back in 2019. After the arrest of the Golden State Killer, the DOJ recognized that forensic genetic genealogy was going to play a significant role within the criminal justice field. And so they did issue this interim policy. It remains an interim policy, but the intent behind it is to share best practices and to provide some guidance on how to apply genealogy to these criminal investigations. If you have never read this, I suggest finding it online. I don't know. You obviously can't click on my link. I don't know if the slides will be shared digitally with you, but um, you can search for the interim policy, find it online and read it and become intimately familiar with it if you are doing genealogy on any of your cases or if you plan to do genealogy on your cases. It does a really great job of explaining the whole process of what genealogy is. But again, it provides the guidance on the types of cases that you should be applying this to, what you should not be applying this to. And then also goes as far as to give some guidance on considerations for taking these cases to trial. So it's a great document, a little lengthy, but I highly encourage you to read it. It does talk about who this policy applies to, and it's very explicit to say that obviously if you are from a federal agency and you're doing genealogy, you have to adhere to this. Or if you are a BJA grantee of any of the programs that excuse me, that receive federal funding and you're allowed to use the funding for genealogy, you have to adhere to this policy. So anyone that is using federal funding to do genealogy, this will come into play. We're going to go through on the next couple of slides, and there are bits and pieces of the policy that I've pulled out to talk about the guidance. But again, I can't stress this enough of how important this document is. It will help us preserve and protect this technology moving forward if we're all adhering and abiding by this guidance. So the interim policy does specify the types of cases that genealogy can be applied to. It talks about how genealogy can be applied to violent crimes, and it further breaks that down into violent crimes being homicides, sexual assaults, and then unidentified human remains cases where the victim is believed to be a victim of a suspected homicide. There's also language in the interim policy that talks about how, with prosecutor concurrence or authorization, we can do genealogy on other types of violent crimes when there is a substantial or ongoing threat to public safety or national security. Excuse me. If you leave here today and you only remember one thing that I say, this is it. The goal of forensic genetic genealogy is to provide investigative leads that will assist law enforcement in identifying an unknown perpetrator or a victim. Genealogy does not identify a suspect, and genealogy does not identify victims. And nor is genealogy grounds for probable cause. All genealogy does is it provides an investigative lead for law enforcement to follow up on. So the way that I think about this in my head is that a genealogist handing the name of a potential suspect to an investigator is no different than an anonymous tipster calling into a call center saying, "I believe Joe Smith committed this crime." Law enforcement would take all the information, they would learn everything they could about Joe Smith to try to make sure that Joe Smith fits within the context of their crime. And this is the same thing. So the name of a potential suspect that comes to law enforcement, it is still up to law enforcement to do that traditional police investigation and make sure that lead information actually seems viable before moving the case forward. And you'll hear me talk about that, as we move forward. There are steps that have to be taken, after the genealogy process before you can go out and make an arrest. And so again, if this is the only thing that you remember, just remember that genealogy, the goal of that is to provide an investigative lead. When we talk about genealogy, it is quite a daunting process if you've never worked through it before. So we are going to break this down a little bit, But just as a high level overview for those of you who have never gone through this, basically the process starts by submitting DNA evidence from your unknown perpetrator to a vendor laboratory that is capable of developing the data that is needed to be uploaded into these genealogy databases that I'm sure you have all heard about. Once the data has been uploaded into these genealogy databases, you're going to get a list of familial matches. Familial match, we'll talk about it with some later slides. Familial match, I think, is not the best term, and it's kind of confusing because when I say you get matches, we're not getting matches to your suspect, like to say this is your suspect. We are getting matches to show that all of these people share DNA with your unknown suspect, and so they are related to your suspect, but it's up to you to figure out how. So we get this list of generated matches between your unknown suspect and these individuals who have also tested with those genealogy companies, and they have uploaded their data and consented to having their data searched against forensic samples. Then it's time to start building out family trees. We build out family trees of the matches, and we try to figure out, it's essentially like a big puzzle, where your unknown suspect actually fits within that family tree. If we are lucky, hopefully we are able to zero in on one person or a couple people. That information is shared with law enforcement as an investigative lead. We have the traditional investigation, and then ultimately at the end, if law enforcement believes they have the right person, we would do confirmatory STR DNA analysis by an accredited lab before moving forward with any type of arrest. All right. So the case submission criteria, all of this was pulled from that interim policy. Um, for a case to qualify for genealogy, we already talked about the requirement of it being an unresolved violent crime. So again, homicides, sex assaults, and then UHR cases where the victims are victims of suspected homicides. That second bullet is that law enforcement has to believe that the forensic sample being submitted for this analysis was actually deposited or came from the perpetrator of the crime. And this sounds like common sense. It sounds, pretty straightforward. But I will say that I have worked with some agencies who were interested in pursuing genealogy by submitting pieces of evidence that were found at the crime scene. And when we talked through it and when I asked, how sure are you that this piece of evidence can be associated to your perpetrator? They weren't. And they said, well, it may end up being a perpetrator, but at the very least, this would give us an idea of somebody else that was at the crime scene that we could talk to. And so that is not allowed. The interim policy is very clear that the DNA samples that are being submitted for genealogy, there has to be a reason to suspect that that DNA was in fact deposited by the suspected perpetrator. The next bullet is extremely important. You have to have a profile already in CODIS. An STR profile has to already be uploaded in CODIS and searching, obviously with no hits before you are able to move forward with genealogy. And you will see the importance of that STR CODIS or that STR profiling CODIS. You'll see the importance of that as we get towards the end of my session. The case also needs to be entered into VICAP and into NamUs when applicable. So if we're dealing with a UHR case, that also needs to go into NamUs. And then the last bullet is the one that seems to give the most confusion, I guess, or it's pretty vague, that all investigative leads have been exhausted. This is exhausted to the extent possible. As you all know, if you've been working in cold case investigations, you could open up a file that maybe hasn't been touched in years, maybe even decades. And when you start going through it, there are probably a million things that you could do now, but more importantly, things that maybe could have been done years ago, right? But they weren't. So when we're talking about all investigative leads need to be exhausted, that is that if you are looking at the case today, are there any big major red flags, things that need to be done, such as you have 5 individuals listed as possible suspects that you know of? Those individuals need to be excluded before we're moving on to genealogy. But we're not talking about how back in 1977, a full neighborhood canvas wasn't done, or investigators haven't been able to talk to all of the neighbors. That's not the type of investigative leads we're referring to. It's just about what you were able to do today and what makes sense to track down before kind of moving on to genealogy as almost a last resort. Okay. Once we know that the case checks all of those boxes, that it actually qualifies for genealogy under the interim policy, then we actually do need to take a look at the DNA sample that is going to be submitted to the vendor laboratory. When we are looking at our sample, we need to know about the quantity, how much human DNA is actually left in that sample, the quality of the DNA. Is it degraded? Does it have a lot of bacterial contamination, especially if we're talking about old bones from a UHR case? And then whether or not that sample contains DNA from more than one individual. These are the three things that, if you have worked with a DNA vendor, an FGG vendor, they're going to be asking questions about this. So back in 2019, when genealogy first started coming around, when we're talking about the quantity of DNA, we needed a lot of DNA to make this possible. When we talk about the quantity of DNA, we refer to it as nanograms. And back in 2019, we were looking at needing at a minimum about 20 nanograms of DNA, it's a lot. Since that time, these labs have perfected their techniques, and we are now able to get sufficient DNA profiles to move forward with genealogy pretty consistently with 1 nanogram of DNA. And some labs have even been successful with less than 1 nanogram of DNA. So while the quantity doesn't seem to be as much of a factor anymore, the labs will still want to know how much DNA you have left, because that can certainly influence how they go about testing the item and their approach to trying to obtain the profile that they need. Same goes with quality. Early on, when we started talking about samples that were degraded and whether or not the DNA was intact, in order for in order to obtain a successful profile, the DNA needed to be pretty good. We were successful with some cases with some highly degraded DNA early on, but in general, the DNA needed to be of good quality. That too has also changed. And now the laboratories aren't really concerned with the quality of the DNA. They are able to handle pretty degraded samples, and they're being successful. But again, this is a conversation that the laboratories are going to want to have with you. And for quantity and quality, and then even mixtures, which I'll talk about in a second, you're probably wondering, how am I going to know any of this? And so this is why, or where this multidisciplinary approach to these types of investigations becomes really, really important, because as an investigator, you shouldn't have to be answering these questions by yourself, and you should be working with your laboratory, your local or state crime lab, to be able to identify all of these things and to be able to provide those answers to the vendor laboratory that will be doing this work for you. This last bullet, mixtures. So as I mentioned, quantity, quality, not so much of an issue anymore, other than just to really be able to guide how we're going to approach testing the sample. But mixtures are still, it's still the one hurdle that a lot of the genealogy vendors haven't been able to overcome yet. So I think I have heard that some vendors have been successful with ratios as low as 50, like a 50-50 ratio, meaning that 50% of the DNA in the sample was contributed by the suspect, 50% in the sample was contributed by the victim. But I think that is very rare. More often than not, we're hearing laboratories say that they can't take mixed samples where the ratios are lower than like around 80-20, meaning that within your sample, the potential suspect has to have contributed at least 80% of that DNA to the sample. So this is still something that varies across the labs. Some labs are lowering those ratios by working on their techniques. I do think that this is something that the vendor laboratories are going to continue working on. And just like quantity and quality, this, I think, probably within the next couple of years, it won't be an issue either. But right now, if you are dealing with the case and you know that the sample you are getting ready to submit is a mixture, just be mindful that this could kind of throw a wrench in the processing for you. And this is something that you will have to talk to the vendor laboratory about. All right. So while we are on the topic of the DNA, you've heard me talk about vendor laboratories throughout this entire presentation. So I just want to clarify why I keep talking about vendor laboratories as opposed to your state and local crime labs. And then also one of the questions that I have received quite a bit is that we have an STR profile already uploaded in CODIS. Why do I have to get something else processed? Why do I need a different type of DNA profile? And the answer is that the technologies that we are using for CODIS eligible profiles and what we need to do for forensic genetic genealogy, it's completely different. We're talking about two different technologies. So for CODIS, you have your crime scene sample, it is processed, and you get an STR profile, which most of you are probably familiar with. It gets uploaded into CODIS, and hopefully, if we're lucky, we get a hit, right? That STR profile, when it goes through the analysis, I have on here approximately 20 locations. What I mean by that is that when it is processed, we are looking at data at approximately 20 different locations. So that is relatively small compared to the type of profile that we are searching for forensic genetic genealogy, when we are taking the DNA and looking at more than 600,000 locations in certain scenarios. So in looking at this more robust profile, this is called a SNP profile, a single nucleotide polymorphism. So SNP, a SNP profile. And this is the type of data that we are using for forensic genetic genealogy. You may hear labs talk about SNP microarray, targeted SNPs, or whole genome sequencing. All of these are different ways to develop a SNP profile. The differences, there are differences obviously within the lab, but the biggest difference is how many locations they're looking at, how much data they're getting. For a SNP microarray, this is really effective when you have a lot of DNA and really good DNA. So when the DNA is intact, SNP microarray is typically what a lot of labs and agencies will lean to. Whole genome sequencing is kind of on the other end of the spectrum. So if you have very little DNA, very degraded DNA, whole genome sequencing would be the way that the labs would want to go. And then targeted SNPs is kind of in the middle. And there are different reasons for going with a targeted SNP over a microarray and whole genome sequencing. But all of that is to say that if you hear these things, we're still talking about developing a SNP profile, which is completely different from your STR profile that's been uploaded into CODIS. And for that reason, while we know that our state, local, federal crime labs are capable of developing the STRs, as of right now, most local state crime labs are not doing SNP analysis. I do think, I think it's already starting to change, that some of these local and state crime labs are wanting to bring this technology in-house, but for the time being, most of them are not doing it, and that is why we have to turn to these private DNA vendors to develop the SNP profile that we need to move these cases forward with genealogy. All right, one more kind of tangent related to the DNA side of things, especially because we are in North Carolina, and North Carolina is a state that does allow familial DNA searching. Um, Oftentimes in conversations with investigators and other folks who are trying to pursue genealogy, I hear confusion between forensic genetic genealogy and familial DNA searching. These are two completely different types of searches, both of which can be resources and can develop investigative leads for these cases. Familial DNA searching, this definition was taken from the FBI's website. So an intentional or deliberate search of the database, meaning CODIS, conducted after a routine search for the purpose of potentially identifying close biological relatives of the unknown forensic sample associated with the crime scene profile. So the way that I think about a familial DNA search and what it actually means. So we're all familiar again with the STR profile that we get. We upload it into CODIS. And when it gets uploaded into CODIS, we are looking for a one-to-one match, right? Like we upload our forensic sample and we are hoping that the perpetrator has committed another crime, their DNA has been uploaded into CODIS, and we get a match, a one-to-one match. For familial DNA searching, think about it as tweaking that algorithm a little bit. So instead of looking for that one-to-one match, we are hoping that that STR profile will match to a relative of our perpetrator. So we are thinking or hoping that potentially a brother or a father of our unknown perpetrator has provided their DNA. It's been uploaded into CODIS, and then that is who we would get the hit to with a familial DNA search. Um, so on the surface, when we're talking about genealogy and familial DNA searching, they look very similar. They're both advanced DNA searching methodologies that use DNA from biological relatives to develop leads to aid in resolving cold case crimes. But again, they are two completely different things. It's just the terminology sometimes just gets intertwined and it can be confusing. So again, with genealogy, we just talked about SNPs. That is the type of DNA technology we're using for genealogy. Familial DNA searches uses that same STR profile that's in CODIS. It also uses YSTRs that we won't go into, but these are the more traditional technologies that you're probably used to in working a lot of these cases. For genealogy, again, these SNPs are developed by private laboratories. Local state forensic laboratories are capable of developing the technologies you need for a familial DNA search. The actual search itself for genealogy, we will be talking about the search being conducted in these genealogy databases that a lot of you are probably familiar with. For familial DNA searching, essentially, it's a search of the CODIS database, but only at the local or state level. This type of search is not permitted by the FBI at a national level, so you can never search the INDIS level of CODIS if you're familiar with that. And then lastly, for FGG, we are able to use this type of search to identify not only close relatives, but also really distant relatives that can help with the investigation. Familial DNA searching, this is only helpful if we are able to identify very close relatives. And by very close, I mean like full sibling, parent, child. I think I heard recently of one familial DNA search being successful. I think an uncle was identified, but outside of that, if you get too much further out, the familial DNA search is not going to be effective. All right. So now getting back to forensic genetic genealogy, we've developed our SNP profile and we are ready to upload it into the genealogy databases. So I'm sure all of you have seen all the commercials for the big name genealogy companies. We have Ancestry, 23andMe, Family Tree DNA. Not all of these genealogy companies are law enforcement friendly. So of the big names, the only genealogy database that does allow law enforcement to upload forensic samples at this point is Family Tree DNA. And for the others, Ancestry, 23andMe, and some of the other companies that are out there, the terms of service explicitly prohibit law enforcement from using their databases. So if you are thinking about doing genealogy or you are doing genealogy, again, please be mindful of those terms of service. And we certainly don't want to start violating them. And we want to stick with family tree DNA for the time being, and just following the rules to preserve this technology. You may have heard of GEDmatch. GEDmatch was created after realizing that of all the big name companies, none of them talk to each other. So, for example, if I would happen to test with Family Tree DNA and my sister tests with Ancestry, we would never match together because those databases do not talk to each other. So GEDmatch was created as a way for folks who test with all these different companies to be able to proactively download their data and upload it into GEDmatch. And so GEDmatch is essentially, a hodgepodge of data from all of these big name companies. And it certainly doesn't have everybody who has ever tested with any of the companies. This is only the database is only populated by those individuals who have taken that proactive step to download their data and upload it into GEDmatch. GEDmatch started being used a lot by law enforcement, by genealogists who were trying to help resolve investigations. And so GEDmatch actually developed a special portal for law enforcement, which is GEDmatch Pro. And this is where law enforcement is able to upload their forensic samples, and where those forensic samples are only searched against those individuals who have chosen to opt in. You may have heard a while back, there was a lot of media and a lot of news surrounding this idea of opting in. Both Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch require their users to check a box and allow their data to be searched against forensic samples. This is called opting in. If they do not opt in to those forensic searches, law enforcement does not have access to any of their data. So when you, for example, go into GEDmatch Pro, a forensic sample is uploaded. Even if I were the sister to that potential suspect, as an example, if I did not opt in GEDmatch, law enforcement would never know about me, at least through GEDmatch, right? So they would never know about me. They would never see my data. They would never even see my name. Both Family Tree and GEDmatch do have fees for uploading forensic samples. I think they are both right now sitting at about $700 a sample to get them uploaded into those databases. I threw DNA Solves up here. DNA Solves is a database that is strictly for unidentified human remains. And I personally don't have a lot of experience with it, and I don't think a lot of our SACI sites have used it yet, but I wanted to make everyone aware that this database is out there, and it's specific to UHRs that we're trying to identify through genealogy. All right. So we've uploaded into the genealogy databases, and now we are getting our matches. Again, if you remember, I mentioned that I don't think matches is the right term. I think matches, it sounds like we're trying to match to the suspect, right? Like we're saying that we got a match to our perpetrator, and that's not what we're saying here. Our list of matches are those consenting consumers who have tested and they've uploaded and they shared DNA with your unknown perpetrator or your unknown victim. So I think a more appropriate term that I heard recently from another training that I participated in is a genetic cousin. So a list of cousins. All of these people share DNA. They are all cousins somehow. But moving forward, just keep in mind that when I'm saying matches, that's who we're talking about. We're talking about these people that share DNA with your unknown suspect or your unknown victim. When you get your match list, not only do you have the list of all the matches, but you also have this column that talks about shared centimorgans. And a centimorgan is nothing more than just a genetic unit of measurement that tells how much DNA the two people share. So how much DNA your suspect shares with this match. The higher number of centimorgans, the more DNA the two share, and the more closely related they are. So there is a tool online that you can Google. It's called, if you go to DNA Painter, DNApainter.com, I believe, and it's called the Shared Centimorgan Project. And I have a screenshot of it here, but it allows you to take the number that you receive for your shared centimorgans, you put it into this tool, and it gives you an idea of how your suspect may be related to that match. So for example, if we get a match back and they share 2,000 centimorgans with our unknown suspect, and I will caveat this saying, I keep saying suspect, we could be talking about an unidentified victim as well. Same thing. But if we put in 2,000 here, these are the relationships that we're looking at. This would be a really good case to work on if we got a match with 2,000 centimorgans, because we would potentially be looking at a grandparent, grandchild, sibling, half sibling, aunt, uncle, niece, nephew relationship. So we're pretty close, and we'd be able to hopefully build out this matches family tree and figure out where our unknown suspect fits into that. By contrast, if we would happen to get a match where we only share 86 centimorgans with that person, things get a lot more complicated. The suspect does not share nearly as much DNA with this match. They are not nearly as closely related, and they could be related in many, many different ways. So this scenario would likely take very extensive tree building. And it would take a very long time to try to resolve this type of case. All right, so building illustrated, we could be here for probably days to talk about how to actually do the tree building. So this is my attempt just to show a very simplified example of how this works, just so that you can wrap your mind around how we go from this list of matches in family tree DNA and how we end up with with a name to provide to law enforcement as this investigative lead. So let's just say that we have match one and match two. Again, these are our genetic cousins, right? On the list. Match one and match two. The very first step before you can even start building out family trees is to identify who those matches actually are. So if any of you have tested just for your own personal interest and you have received matches back through any of the genealogy companies, you've probably realized that when you see your matches, a lot of people use aliases. A lot of people don't necessarily use their own email address. And so in order to identify who those matches are, it takes some investigative work, a lot of analytical work. And some matches we're never able to identify who they are. The limited information that law enforcement receives, I know that there is a misconception out there that if anybody tests with any of these companies, that law enforcement gains access to a lot of additional information about that person, but that's not accurate. The only thing that law enforcement can see is what is provided by that individual when they sign up. So that is whether it's their real name or an alias, their email address, and then there are a couple other categories depending on what database you're using that individual could choose to fill out. And that's all law enforcement has to work with. Okay. So let's say match one and match two. We've already gone through that process. We figured out who they are, and we know that they are first cousins. If we know that they're first cousins, we know that they're related, we know that at some point within their family trees, they have to share an ancestor, right? So in order for them to be related, somewhere they shared an ancestor. So that is the first goal of tree building. So you would have your matches and you would want to build backwards to figure out the most recent common ancestor, so the MRCA. Um, Knowing that these two matches are first cousins share a set of grandparents, right? So we would build back and figure out who these grandparents are. And in our example, you can see them there at the top. So we know that if match one and match two are first cousins, they both descend from this set of grandparents, and they are both related to our perpetrator also descends from that most recent common ancestor. Okay. So we build back, we identify who this MRCA is, and then the next step or the next goal of the tree building process is to then build down. We want to know who falls under that, if you, I guess you could say, that branch of the family tree. We want to build out that entire branch of the family tree, identifying all of grandma and grandpa's descendants, their grandkids, their great grandkids. And we would build down until we got to a level where we felt like we had placed the unknown perpetrator on our tree. Okay. And that being able to know when to stop building, there's a lot of things that go into that. We look at the shared centimorgans again. You can look at the relationships between the perpetrator and other matches. You can take into account the estimated age of your unknown perpetrator. So that could help you determine like what generation this person may fit in. But for my example, trying to keep it simple, let's say that based on the amount of DNA that our suspect shares with match one and match two, let's say our hypothesis is that they're also first cousins. All of them are first cousins. So we would want to identify all of the grandchildren of grandma and grandpa, right? To get down to that first cousin level. And again, in this example, it's very easy. Grandma and grandpa only had one other child. That individual only had one other child. And this individual in yellow circled, that would be the person that I would choose to provide to law enforcement as an investigative lead for them to look into. Did I lose everybody in the example? I know this was very extremely simplified. It's never this easy. But just in general, the idea is that we're taking that list of matches and we're trying to figure out who the common ancestor is between these individuals, knowing that if we're able to find that person, that our perpetrator falls within that same branch of the family tree. Okay. All right. My slides got kind of mixed up a little bit, so I'm going to go back to that slide in just a second. But one of the things that I did want to bring up is reference collections. So throughout the course of the tree building process, you may be asked to do a reference collection or a target test. People refer to them in different ways. But these are DNA samples that are collected throughout the tree building process to try to confirm or refute a working theory, um, or yeah, a working theory with the actual family tree. So this is essentially used to really focus the tree building process. It can help zero you in on a particular branch or exclude a branch. And I have an example that I'll show you in just a second. But this really helps when we are dealing with issues of endogamy or incest, adoptions, or misattributed paternity. Just in situations where we really get stuck with the family tree, reference testing can really help here. This is a collection from an individual who has been identified on the family tree. This person typically is identified through the use of public records or, whatever resources are used to add people to the family tree, but this person hasn't necessarily tested yet. They haven't gone through the process of getting one of the kits. They haven't tested, so we don't know the exact genetic relationship between that individual and our unknown perpetrator. These collections are done using a family tree DNA kit is the easiest way. It's not the same as going out and getting a reference collection with a buccal swab. This is law enforcement typically goes and they will do this interview and this collection using a family tree DNA kit, and that kit gets sent back to the lab to family tree DNA, just like any other kit, just as if that individual had ordered the kit and done it themselves. When their DNA is processed, it gets uploaded. And then, of course, if they are a match, if law enforcement is on the right track, that data would then be populated and they would be able to see it in that list of familial matches. The collection is voluntary, and it is done with informed consent. We work with SACI. We work very closely with the FBI's investigative genetic genealogy team, and they train or provide guidance on these reference collections a lot. They have done a lot of them, and they've been very successful with them. And again, we could do a whole session on just reference collections, but the biggest takeaways from what they have taught our SACI sites is that these interviews are not like other interviews that you have done. When they go to do one of these reference collections, they kind of lay everything out on the table. Why they are there, what genealogy is, how they came across the individual that they're trying to collect from, how this person plays into the whole investigation, how this person could really help break open a case that has sat dormant for years. They talk to them about the victim. Does the victim have did they leave behind any children? Like they really lay everything out so that individual really knows what is happening, why they're giving their DNA, and they also talk to them about what's going to happen with their DNA, so that it's going to be going into the genealogy databases. And when the investigation is over, that DNA will either be removed or there are certain times when the individual becomes interested in their own genealogy and they're able to take over that profile. But that's what these reference collections are. This is not the same as confirmation testing that we will be talking about in just a second. Okay. So as an example, again, this is going to be a very simplified example. Let's say that we have identified our most recent common ancestor. In this example, I think I included them as a set of great grandparents. All right. And let's say that based on all the other things in our investigation, our shared centimorgans, our matches, everything, we believe that our potential suspect is likely at the great grandchild level at that generation. All right. So we would want to build down from here, right? And identify all of the great grandchildren. Doesn't sound too difficult, except if great grandma and great grandpa have 8 kids, and those 8 kids have a bunch of kids, and those kids have a bunch of kids. So now we are down at this generation level with the great grandchildren. And what do you do with all of those individuals? You could start building timelines on all of them. You could be running criminal histories on all of them. You could go get DNA samples from all of them. Or we could try to do a reference test and see if we could narrow down which branch of the tree we really need to be focusing on. So I pulled out just a subset of that example. Again, we are looking at our potential suspect being a great grandchild. So down at this generational level. If we chose to do a reference collection of this person, that person, if we're on the right track, would be a grandparent to our potential suspect. Is everyone following that? It would be a grandparent. So when we did the reference collection and we uploaded it and we would get the data back, we would expect to see shared centimorgans consistent with a grandparent grandchild relationship. If we don't see that and we see shared centimorgans that are suggesting a more distant relationship, so maybe an uncle or something along those lines, we know we're not on the right track here and we can eliminate this entire branch of the family tree. Okay? So that is how reference testing is used. This again is an oversimplified version or example. Typically, we don't want to test grandma or grandpa of our potential suspects just because of how close they could be to that individual. Usually in when reference tests are done, the trees are a lot bigger and we are testing individuals that if they were ever confronted with the actual name of the perpetrator, they are so distant, they have no idea who that individual is or even that branch of the family tree, if you will. So reference testing can be a really useful tool. And I think I don't know of any genealogy case yet that I have been involved in where this hasn't taken place. Um, all right, let me back up. Apologies to this about the slide that got out of place a little bit. But once we have built out our trees, this is where the follow-up investigation comes in, right? I mentioned law enforcement will receive this investigative lead. This is where the traditional police work comes in. And I don't need to tell any of the investigators in here how to do their investigation, but you're going to receive a name. And this is where the timelines come into play. You're going to start trying to figure out where that person was at the time of the crime, running their criminal history, figuring out if their physical description matches the witness statements, all of those things. And if this person actually fits within the context of the crime and you decide to move forward, then it is time for confirmation DNA testing. Um, this quote was pulled directly from the interim policy. A suspect shall not be arrested based solely on a genetic association generated by a genetic genealogy service. So again, forensic genetic genealogy does not give you probable cause to move forward with an arrest. You have to do the confirmation DNA testing. This is typically done through a surreptitious collection. There are other ways. I have heard of other scenarios where law enforcement's been able to obtain a voluntary sample. They've been able to use different, a warrant to get a buccal swab, but more often than not with these cases, I see these collections done surreptitiously. So law enforcement would get a sample from this potential suspect. It would be sent off to an accredited crime lab, so not back to the private DNA vendor. Um, Ideally, this would go back to the same lab that you use to develop your STR profile. So your state, local crime lab would be able to process this sample. They would develop an STR profile and do a direct comparison to that STR profile that is already in CODIS. And so by doing this, we are comparing our possible suspects' DNA directly to the DNA that was deposited at the crime scene. Okay. This is where you get your probable cause. This is the information that would go to trial. There's a lot we could have a whole session as well, and I didn't include it in my slides, but there's a lot of talk about prosecutorial considerations right now for genealogy, as we are now starting to see a lot of these cases make their way forward and going to trial. And one of the biggest pushes right now is that if we are treating this as an investigative lead, all of the information about genealogy should stay out of the courtroom to the extent possible, right? So this is what you have to push. There was an investigative lead, but we confirmed this through traditional STR methods. Okay. All right. Key takeaways. Again, the goal of FGG is to provide law enforcement with investigative leads. I can't say that enough. Arrests cannot be made solely based on genealogy data. We have to do that confirmation sample. And while it is certainly proven to be effective, I don't think anybody would argue that there are limitations. We talked about the need right now to use private vendors. It can be very costly. It's expensive. We also talked about some of the technology limitations specifically related at this time to mixtures. This isn't going to solve every case. And just as I have there, this should never be used in lieu of a traditional, thorough police investigation. And one of the other limitations that we didn't touch on too much, but hopefully maybe you implied, given the examples of the different variations of centimorgans, this process can be very lengthy, and you never really know how long this is going to take until you get those matches. So if you upload and you're lucky enough to get a grandparent-grandchild relationship right off the bat, it's going to be quick for you. But if you're in that 86 centimorgan scenario, this could take it could take a very long time. I've personally been involved in cases where we have uploaded the data and the case has been resolved in less than an hour. I've also been involved in cases that have taken multiple years, and some of them are still ongoing because the matches just aren't there yet. So it is very successful, but it's not going to solve everything for us. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sergeant Hudson.
Thank you, Ashley. You guys hear me okay back there? It doesn't come up. But yeah, so I've I'm retired. I've been in law enforcement for over 25 years. I've run into burning buildings trying to save people. I've come across domestic scenes where people were actively involved, and I've had to kind of confront people with knives and all sort of kind of things. Been in active shooter situations. I'm gonna tell you what, this was probably one of the worst situations I've been in, sitting in that chair with that bright light staring at me, and you guys watching you guys and hearing Ashley talk and not being able to interject. That was kind of like I'd take a fight, a run into a burning building or something like that any day rather than do that. Where she's talking about this FGG. What I wanted to try to do today is to give a practical application of what she's talking about. We've utilized FGG before. We utilized a lot of DNA technology in solving some of our cases. Like I said, I've been in law enforcement for over 25 years or so. I started my career in Ohio, and I worked there about 10 years, and then I came down to Fayetteville, and worked my time there before I retired. Once I retired, I came back, and now I currently work as a cold case investigator there with them. So I work back in the sexual assault unit that I supervised before I retired. And so now I help pretty much assist the cold case detective that's currently there now, sexual assault cold case detective, Jessica Lewis. And so we want to thank RTI for inviting me here. This has been a great experience. I've been to different conferences before, but this is the first time I think that I've been where it's totally been RTI. We deal with RTI a lot in a lot of our investigations and stuff. So I see names, I interact with people on Zoom calls before, but this is the first time I've actually got a chance to come to the facility. A very impressive facility, very impressed with the research work that you do. I've only been able to see it from my end from the sexual assault side, but now after these couple of days to be able to hear how intricately involved y'all are with so many other aspects of my profession, different things that happen in the community. I do applaud you guys, and I would say keep on doing the research, because as you will see from, if I get a chance to talk a little bit about a case, a lot of the research that you do does help us as we're trying to navigate through some of these cases. Um, I had some slides together because what I was going to do is just talk about a specific case. It's a great test case for FGG and how this multidisciplinary team all comes together. We were successfully able to get an arrest in that, but it hasn't gone through the whole adjudication process yet. So I wrestled last night with, I said I was just going to go general. So I put some slides together that just wasn't specific to the case, but had general information on it. I wrestled last night. I just couldn't sit with it because I don't want anything to happen with that case that gets, that messes it up in court. So I came in and I had my friend back there delete a lot of those slides. So what I'll try to do is I'll try to talk in general terms in the application of a lot of the things that she talked about today, because we've had a few cases where we've utilized um, forensic genealogy, and we've utilized familiar, and we've utilized actually the YSTR um, in that. Do we have anybody from the lab personnel here? Good, because if I say anything, non-specific to the proper lab terminology, I don't want them throwing anything at me. But but we've been successful. You guys, most of you probably heard about the Ramsey Street case. That's one of our premier cases where we've used FGG. I didn't necessarily want to use that case. John Summerdike is probably the best person to talk that case. He was intricately involved in that. But I mean, I figure we've talked that enough to where you probably heard everything about that. It is a good example of FGG. However, we have had other cases where we've used genetic genealogy and other things that she's mentioned up there, and it's been successful. But that case there, the Ramsey Street, that was my one of my first cases as a sergeant of that unit. I came in, and so I got a chance to do a little bit there. But John, pretty for the most part, handled spearheaded the movement with that. But I will say, when it comes to the investigative side of FGG, the Ramsey Street case is pretty typical about how we'll approach those cases. Um, the case in particular I'm talking about now, um, in a general terms, we utilized an outside lab to do genealogy for us. And when we do those cases, and I'm mostly talking to some of my law enforcement partners that may be considering FGG and not using it, just like Ashley said, it's just a lead, but and sometimes it can take months to years for them to get back some of the information that we need. That's not we don't sit on our hands while all that is happening, right? We're not sitting around waiting for a lab result. What we're doing during that time period is actually doing the old nuts and bones of an investigator getting out there and trying to solve the case. What we try to do, what I always push my people to do, and what I do now, even as I'm back, I try to make sure that part of it confirms what I already know, right? And so I let them do their part and the things that they do, but what we do is we make sure that we're communicating along the way. And one of the cases in particular that we had, they, you know, it was one of those cases where we had exhausted all we submitted evidence, they got a profile back, sitting in, went into the state coded system, federal coded system, and we weren't getting any traction on it, no hits back or anything like that. And so we utilized grant funds to do familiar testing, didn't get anything back from that. And then, so we finally got to the level where we were approved to get FGG. And so we utilized a private lab to let them do that work. And we were collabing with them back and forth. And I got one of those, as she talking about that distant cousin thing back, person back. As a matter of fact, we had two distant cousins. And so now I've got to sit here. You see that long number of people that she had there. I got to sift through all of that to try to figure out, what you really do in a case like that is it's like a horror show. You're trying to eliminate people. You're trying to eliminate people. This person couldn't be, that person couldn't be and try to get that number down to a smaller little sample. Well, I had two people, and I thought, okay, this is going to be pretty cool. I could probably make this connection. And I mean, it took months for me trying, and I couldn't put the two together. I couldn't make the connection. And so, but one of them I really got hard into, really start following up obituaries. I mean, I really took this person apart and looking at surnames and all this kind of stuff. And fortunately for us in this case, the offender, he was always around the case. He was around the case in the beginning. but they weren't able to get his information in the beginning because he refused to cooperate, right? Um, and you hear, I don't know if y'all look at cop shows and stuff like that. They talk about that gut feeling that you have, that they have. I mean, that's real. Sometimes you can look at a case and it's just something about an individual or an aspect of the case that you just can't let go. And so that individual, I just couldn't let it go. It was just strange to me why his actions would be the way they were. We had several other people involved that were POIs, what we call them, persons of interest, and they reacted typically the way you would think they should react. A lot of them cooperated and submitted their stuff. They said they didn't have anything to hide. This particular individual would not, and that just that never left me. So in one part of me, I'm thinking about him, but then I'm thinking about this relative that came back from genealogy. And as I thought, so I stopped with the relative because it was frustrating me and I was running into a brick wall. And I started looking into him, right? This guy. And I just really kind of dove deep into his life, everything about him. Uh, I'm from Fayetteville. I'm from Fayetteville, North Carolina. So, the military post is down there. And so it happens to be this gentleman was a soldier, right? So she talked about that MDT, the multidisciplinary team. We don't solve these cases by ourselves. These cases, in order for them to be solved, we got input from all different type of partners. So I keep a good relationship with my military people because a lot of times some of our perpetrators have spent some time in the military. And so I need that connection to be able to go to them when I need them. So this particular individual, he had some military time. So we partnered up with their civilian investigative division, and we were able to, collab on some things. But in diving deep into his life, I saw something in there that reminded me that I saw from the distant relative. And that's when the light bulb went on for me. And from that, it was on from that point. Um, and so with these cases, right? And so months going by, still nothing from the private lab, still nothing from the genealogy folks. And so I began to, after I made this connection, that I, put a face on this connection, I submitted his information to them. They went ahead, did their little tree thing, and we end up finding a connection between the two, some 2 or 3 generations up. And so, but I'd already knew at that point that connection, but it was able to be confirmed basically with the FGG. So the PC that we couldn't get back in the period of time where the crime occurred, now I had the PC that was necessary for me to get the DNA. And so I had already been tracking him. And that's what I said. We don't just sit on our loins while we're waiting for the FGG folks to do their stuff. We had already been tracking him. I knew where he lived. I knew where he worked. I knew who, all these relatives in town. So once we got our chance to get our PC, um, it was nothing to go find him and get his DNA. He still tried to play that whole, he didn't want to cooperate, yada, yada, yada. But we had the paperwork, like she said. Sometimes, it's different ways where you get it. Sometimes they'll voluntarily give it, sometimes you do it. Um, um, you know, I call it, sneaky, but sometimes you get it that way, or sometimes you just got to get the old fashioned way to search warrant. So we had a search warrant, so he had to give it. So long story short, once he gave it up, sent it up to the lab, just like she said, to do our confirmation, and boom, we got a confirmation that it was consistent with the profile that we had from the scene. So and so all cases don't happen that smoothly, but that's just an example I wanted to give you to show you how practically the things that she was talking about, it does come together when it comes down to, in real life, these cases. And I know we've got some people online and stuff, so I just would encourage some of my other agencies that's not using FGG. go ahead and use it. Like she said, it's a tool. And none of these investigations go all exactly the same. There's usually different little elements in them that makes them unique and different. And I'm like this. I want these clowns locked up. So for me, it's a matter of I don't we use whatever we can that's legally that we're available to get these clowns off the street. Because I don't know if she mentioned it or I think I heard it with somebody else's presentation. They don't just commit sexual assaults. What we found is most of the time, by the time they get to the level of committing a sexual assault, they probably committed some more crimes too. And I'm excited about this lawfully owed presentation that's coming out after this, because that's going to be my push in this next phase. Because we've got a lot of people out there that owe DNA that's walking around here not having not gave up their DNA. And I think if we would collect that DNA, a lot of our cases would be solved. A lot of our cases would be solved. So I'm interested in hearing their presentation. Um, I'm an investigative assistant. I came back out of retirement to do it because I do believe in the work. I would push, and I'm this mainly, I guess, for my people online. If you have those funds available, if you can't spend it on get an investigative assistant, because one of the things that's plaguing a lot of our police departments across the country is personnel. So it's not that we don't want to work cases. A lot of times it's just not the people available to work cases. When I was active, I had about 5 detectives under me. We were pushing about 200 cases of sexual assault a year. And then because of shortages, we had to start working some of these cold cases. So it's not that we don't want to work. You will not hardly ever find a cop that don't want to go out and find a bad guy and put him in jail. If you find, it's rare. I'm not saying that all cops want to do that, but it's rare that you'll find one that don't want to do that. Most of us want the people locked up and off the streets. So if you have funding out there under Saki, or use it on an investigative assistant, grab some of those guys that are retired and get them back in the game. There's something that I bring to the table that a young detective won't. I'll see things because of my experience that they won't see, that they may miss. Um, they're retired, but they still kind of got that itch. I think I lasted a summer before I got back in the game. There's only so much, what do they got, the honeydew list? There's only so much you could do to your house. At some point you run out of stuff. And so when the offer came up, I jumped at it, and I will tell you, it's been good for me because we've been able to lock up some of our key serial cases that had been left unsolved since the '90s, and that brings a lot of satisfaction to me to be able to come get these clowns, in the middle of their life now, thinking they got away with it, and so that's my spill. That's my contribution to this. I hope it was something worth y'all waiting to hear it. But another final thing, if we have any agencies that's listing, we have funds available. Part of our um, part of what we got from our grant is that we would be a funding house for any agency that wanted to utilize FGG but did not have the funding available. Come get in contact with our department, and we'll help fund all the costs that it costs for you to do that, because we have it available. And that's pretty much all I have for that. I appreciate you guys' time. I appreciate you inviting me here, and we'll see you guys around. Okay.
Can you discuss any limitations with CODIS due to constraints within who is in the database, DB, and DNA composition?
I'm not sure that I quite understand the question, but when we're talking about some limitations with CODIS and who is actually in the database, that is something that I know Lindsay, my colleague, is going to talk about a lot during the next session. But when we're talking about trying to get these profiles uploaded, the STR profiles that are derived from crime scene samples, and we're trying to upload them into CODIS to be compared against the offender index, what we are finding is that a lot of offenders, whether arrestees or those who have actually been convicted, depending on the state, who do lawfully owe their DNA, those individuals are not in CODIS. And so there's many different reasons that have been identified for that, that again, Lindsay is going to speak to. But we have seen, I apologize, I don't remember if I mentioned this in my presentation, but we've seen folks who are sitting on death row who have never provided their DNA. Their DNA is not in CODIS. And so when we are uploading crime scene samples, we're thinking that we are submitting a sample to be compared to all of those types of offenders and the most heinous offenders, and we're really not. We're missing a lot of people. So there are certainly limitations within the CODIS database, and I know that Lindsay's going to be talking about that a little bit more. I hope that answered the question, or at least got to a little bit of it.
Yeah, and if it was from an investigative standpoint, I would say that's where they're having that good relationship with your lab comes into play, because I remember on one of our cases, when they say they upload to CODIS, you just automatically think, okay, it's in the federal system, but I know there's different levels of CODIS. If I'm not mistaken, there's you have the local, state, and the federal level. So making sure that conversation and that communication with your lab personnel, where if you're not getting traction, that you go back and check. Because I was thinking with one of my cases, I knew the state that the person came from, and I was thinking that they had already checked that, but they actually had to do another run through that particular state to see if anything would come up. So it's really having a good relationship with your lab and talking through those things like that.
Yeah, question. Actually, one for each of one of you, but for Sergeant Hudson, are there things when you're FGG as much, or some lessons learned for you? What were some things maybe you weren't expecting that you learned as part of the process that you could share with others?
Lessons learned. I think the biggest thing is it does take some work, and you really have to be tenacious, and not all of them are going to line up the same. Some of them, you may have, depending on the profile, some of them you may have more evidence that you could submit. So you just really have to go into it, each case, with an open mind, a clean slate, and try as much as you can with it. The biggest thing I would say I wouldn't do is, like she said, with the results that, okay, yeah, in one case, from the private lab, several of, like she was talking about, those results came back, like this person could be, that person could be, this person could be, that person could be. And I mean, it was, and so what we had to do is try to look at which of those results were feasible enough, and geography plays a point. You look at the results that they give you, and you can have a person that's never been to North Carolina. In our case, never been to North Carolina, but I'm putting that one over to the side for the most part, because more than likely, that whole family is, I don't know, on the West Coast somewhere. So just learning to take whatever results that you get back, and really, you got to get into it, and don't just accept the initial thing that comes back, but really try to look at what's the story behind a lot of those results.
Thank you. And I guess probably more for Ashley, but with the public, or the public DNA databases that are available, it seems, certainly not an expert in any of that, but there seems like 23andMe, some of the ones you hear about the most, that this is only a small number of them. Just curious if you have some idea of what size of the overall of these databases, what proportion are we really able to access as part of that? How much are we missing, I guess? And are there any opportunities to expand that over time?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kevin. And I actually wish I had those stats, because I just saw recently, I saw numbers. We had the different genealogy databases broken down by the number of users, and I think it was even further broken down by the number of users who had opted in. That information is very difficult to find online. It's not just readily accessible. It's not very easy to find. But I will say that the databases that are not law enforcement friendly at this point are the biggest ones. So thinking about Ancestry by far has the most users. And so when we are limited to family tree DNA and GEDmatch, those are two of the smaller of the databases. And so we are limited in the matches that we are able to get just because of the different terms of service and what these databases and the companies allow. I hope that at some point that some of those terms of service will change and some of the larger databases will be more open to working with law enforcement or coming up with the plan to be able to work with their users and identify those who also want to opt in for these types of searches. It hasn't happened yet, but I have to remain hopeful that one day it will. In that breakdown that I was just referencing that I saw during another training, it was they had the percentages of what is the likelihood of your top match being X, like being a first cousin or being this type of relative. And while I don't remember the exact percentages, what we did see and what was very apparent is that if Ancestry or some of the other larger genealogy databases would allow law enforcement access, that many more of these cases would be solved because we would be increasing our chances of identifying a top match at like a first cousin level. So right now, most of the investigations that I have seen when we're dealing with the top matches, it's beyond a first cousin. Like we're looking at second and third cousins is typically what I hear about the most. But if we did have access to some of those larger databases, the chances of identifying a relative much closer increases drastically. So.
All right. Well, thank you again to our presenters, Ashley and Sergeant Hudson. We have time now for a break. If everyone could be back by 3:30, that'd be great.